So much for being here with us. My name is Nuala Finnegan. I'm professor in Latin American Studies at University College Cork, for those of you that don't know me, and we're delighted to be involved in supporting this conference and in participating in this event today. I'm joined today by four wonderful artists, poets, multidisciplinary creative practitioners, and I'm going to ask each of them to turn on their cameras in the hope that we can replicate to some extent the form of a conversation, even though that is a very difficult thing to do online. Before I introduce them, I'd like to say, in addition to welcoming you all here, a thank you to the extraordinary organizer that is Gabriella McAvoy, and who has just delivered a wonderful keynote address, and who has remained calm in all of the organizing months leading up to this conference, as well as the team that is supporting Silas at the Universidad del Pacífico. So we're enormously grateful to the people who are enabling this virtual connectedness, and we look forward to continuing the conversations in the course of the next few days. I'm personally delighted to be here to draw our invited guests into a conversation. Obviously, much of what we're discussing at the conference in these few days is about the past, but at the heart of Silas and the Society for Irish Latin American Studies is, of course, that concern with the connections and the connectedness between Ireland and the broad diversity of countries that make up Latin America. And of course, that continues in the present and is enlivened and sustained by the presence of both Irish people in Latin America and Latin American communities resident in Ireland. And I suppose the aim and the objective of this session a little bit is to unpick and to tease out a little bit, what are those connections, how do those relationships form, and how are they sustained through creative practice? So I am hugely privileged to be able to lead this conversation, and my guests today are Isabela Basombrío Hoban, Dylan Brennan, Giovanni Mangiante, and John Ennis. And I know you'll join me in giving a big Silas welcome to them. We are here in different points of the world. Dylan is joining us from Mexico City, Isabela from Castlebar in County Mayo, John is in Waterford, the closest to me geographically, and Giovanni is joining us from Peru. So we're connecting across time, across space, across genre. These are all artists that work in different genres. These are artists of different generations, and I'm hoping that together we will generate what Alberto Moreiras calls interstitial sparks, or those sparks that are generated by the in-betweenness of the unexpected, those chispas that come about when the unexpected are conjoined in conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my first two guests. Rather than get involved in very long introductions at this point, I'm going to introduce them gradually to you. And as the conversation develops, I know that you will have your own questions and comments about what they're saying and the work that they are sharing with you. So please, I hope that you can put your comments, questions, or reflections in the chat, and we'll do our best to open up at the end and share those with our panelists. So first off, I'm going to introduce Isabela Basombrío Hoban, who's a multidisciplinary artist based in Castlebar in County Mayo since 1999. So she's been in Ireland for a long time, and she works in music, in art, in poetry. She recently delivered a wonderful presentation on her work, which was showcased by the Biennual de Arte in Cusco on the occasion of the Bicentenario. I've got to know her over the last year or two, and I'm enormously impressed by the reflective nature of her work and the richness of its texture and what it can tell us about being an artist in 21st century Ireland. And I'm going to draw into that conversation Dylan Brennan, who's an Irish poet based in Mexico City. Dylan's first collection of poetry was published in 2014, Blood Oranges, to huge critical acclaim. He's currently finalizing a second collection, has published widely in different publications in the meantime. He's also an academic. I've enjoyed working with Dylan for many years. We've co-published a book together, and he completed a PhD at University College Cork some years ago, looking at the multidisciplinary work of Juan Rulfo. So I'm going to start with Isabela and Dylan and move then into a conversation with Giovanni and John. And Isabela, I'm wondering if we might open the conversation about that idea of in-betweenness, because you said something very interesting to me in an earlier conversation, that when you arrived to Ireland, you lost the accent in your name, Basombrío, and that in losing that accent, something was taken away and something was put back in, that sense of both loss and gain. So I'm wondering if you might just start us off speaking about how that works in terms of who you are and your creative practice.
Thank you very much, Nuala, and I'm delighted to be part of this conversation and honored to be involved in this amazing conference. Congratulations to the organizers, to Gabriela and to Silas, who's done fantastic work over the years to create these connections. And yes, it's very true. And even there, I'm looking at my name and I see the accent is not there. But on the plane, leaving my country, the accent disappeared in the wind. But when I arrived, I was given another accent. And with that came also a title of being a Peruvian artist, whereas before I was just kind of an artist. With that came a lot of unconscious carrying of culture that I think we carry with us without knowing, and what to do with that. In my case, there were several things that unconsciously came out in my work. One of them was a devotion to nature. The other one was use of emotion and also the body, things that I did not know I was doing until it was pointed out to me. Now, these things, like the nation, are things that we have tried to control. We have tried to control, and it hasn't really worked out too well. I suppose we can agree with that one. But the main challenge, I think, at the moment is the control of meaning. I think it's becoming more and more difficult to find a space in which to create meaning. Traditionally, artists were the meaning makers, and I don't mean this in the elitist way of the artist as a prophet, but more of the artist as an agent. And personally, I feel with the time right now of the great curatorial project, that everything is curated. Even the other night, I went to a restaurant and found out my dinner had been curated too. So I actually, by the way, also worked as a curator. So it's not a criticism on the work, but I'm just saying that it's not as easy to be direct with this creation of meaning. It now has to go through the gates. And I sometimes wonder in that in-betweenness where we will be able to regain a place in which we can be agents of creation of meaning, which once you're an immigrant and in the world of culture becomes even maybe a bit more hidden. That space is not as clear.
Yes, and I mean, you draw that out really beautifully for us. Do you feel that responsibility, Isabela, as an artist, in terms of your duty to the work, to create the meaning, to make the meaning, and to have that meaning be transmitted?
I feel that is the most important thing. It would be one of the things that would interest me more. I think within the world of the arts, and I think this is across all disciplines, most definitely writing, visual art and music, where there is, as I said, it has to be curated, but outside of the arts and maybe also in the arts, meaning now is only linked to profit, something is meaningful if we can derive some kind of profit or some kind of concrete benefit to someone. So I think those spaces are narrowing and becoming smaller.
And that's a great that's a great shame. I think the way you sketch it there, that the narrowing of the channels through which the work can be transmitted. And I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Isabella, on that. Dylan, would you have similar views to Isabella, or would you like to respond to the more general point about the in-betweenness and the moving between worlds that is often assigned to poets and writers who are supposedly not living in their place of origin? Whether or not it is felt always is another point.
Sure, thank you very much. So yeah, I was very interested with Isabella talking about being known as a Peruvian artist as well, because since I've come here, I'm the Irish poet, which can be a bit scary and brings a lot of responsibility, but it can be a privilege as well, because some people, most people over here are quite well disposed toward the Irish for some reason. Yeah, talking about in-betweenness, well, obviously working and studying Juan Rulfo and, you know, his novel Pedro Páramo, and this idea of the inframundo and the dead and the living sort of co-mingling together, that's been a bit of an obsession of mine for a long time. And you were talking about the past, and, you know, I suppose, I mean, the quote you always hear from Faulkner about, you know, the past is, it's never dead, it's not even the past. And yeah. So I live in a place, Mexico City, where the past is everywhere, you know. The violent conquest was not that long ago, and you can see it everywhere. You go into the city center and you can see the past and the present just knocking shoulders all the time. And it reminds me, years and years ago, I read Arguedas's Los Ríos Profundos, and it's like on the second page, I think, or the first page, right at the beginning, the protagonist gets into Cusco, and someone says, you know, this used to be an Inca palace, and he's like, it's so in your face, and that's the way Mexico is, you know. And I live in Mexico City now, but I lived a few years ago in Cholula, Puebla, and I mean, you've got this great metaphor, or is it even a metaphor of the possibly the largest pyramid in the world, with the Catholic Church on top of it, you know. And it's just like every September you have people dancing to Quetzalcoatl, and then you have people singing to La Virgen de los Remedios, right, you know, on the top of the pyramid, you know. So this sort of this in-betweenness, but also this just co-mingling, you know, very crowded spaces. There's an Irish writer, Kerry Doherty, who just wrote a book called Thin Places. And I'm obsessed with what I see as crowded places, and they're almost the same thing, you know. But everywhere we go, the past and the present are just here, in your face all the time, yeah. And that's very much an interest of mine. And then yeah. No, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I'm interrupted you. Go on, continue.
I don't know what I was going to say. Go ahead, you can ask.
Well, okay, this is when it starts to sound like a real conversation, which is a good thing. I'm just wondering your comments there about the sense of the present, the past, the visibility, that sense of being part of, you know, historic violences, if you like. Is that less discernible in your experience in Ireland? Do you feel that sense of the past in the same visceral way?
In Dublin, yeah, but I mean, my brother lives in Belfast, and so, you know, that's a whole other story. You know, you're reminded of that everywhere, the murals and things that happened. Like there was a bomb in Derry maybe 2 years ago. You know, so but yeah, in Dublin, I suppose it's I do feel it less obvious. I mean, we hear about these things in school and the famine, etc., etc. But you know, Dublin's a very, very, very old city. Mexico City is quite new. Even though it feels so old, when you walk around the center. It's far newer than Dublin. Even as far as I know, Tenochtitlan, you know, Dublin is older than Tenochtitlan. You know, so a lot of that is gone. So you got to go into the museums, and then you walking around the museums, you see it. But that's kind of that's sort of taken away from the streets and put in boxes, you know. Yeah. And then that's where, you know, Seamus Heaney's book North, it feels like a book about someone who's walking around museums, you know. Yeah. And it's a great book. I love the book. But yeah, it feels less present, less in your face, I would say. Yeah.
More contained, perhaps. I'm going to go back to Isabella for a moment, Isabella, and ask you to read for us. And I'm going to ask all of our invited guests to share some of their work with us today. And Isabella, I was struck earlier when you spoke about the importance of the land and nature, and you can see this in your work. So I'm wondering if you might start by reading your poem Piedras for us, and in the kind of bilingual spirit of Silas, I think we've agreed you'll read it in Spanish and I will read the English translation, and we might say you might say a little bit about it once you've finished reading, but over to you first. Piedras.
Thank you, Nuala. Piedras. Las piedras tienen su memoria, aunque casi nadie lo sabe. Han sido testigo de tanto y tantos, pero en Cusco sí lo saben. Saben el misterio de convertir las piedras a una masa de pan para moldarlas como rompecabezas y hacer estructuras sublimes. Pero los irlandeses también lo saben. Saben que un field es definido por su muro, por líneas y líneas de muros como venas de sangre corriendo por todo el campo y entendiendo que hasta el mismo final tiene comienzo. Mientras tanto, yo sigo aprendiendo cómo moverme entre paredes sin necesidad de derrumbarlas, y por eso creo que seguirán hablando conmigo, aunque yo ya me fui.
Stones. Stones have their memory, although almost no one knows it. They have witnessed so much and so many, but in Cusco they know it. They know the mystery of turning the stones into bread dough, to mold them like jigsaw puzzles and make sublime structures. But the Irish know it too. They know that a field is defined by its wall, by lines and lines of wall, like veins of blood running all over the countryside, and understanding that even the very end has a beginning. In the meantime, I continue to learn how to move between walls without the need to tear them down. And that's why I think they will keep talking to me, even though I'm gone. And Isabela, that poem it really sums up this sense of you as moving really fluidly between identities, but in a way that's very enabling and very open. Is that how you imagine it to be? Or is that how you sense it? Is that how you want it to be communicated?
Yes, exactly, Nuala. I think at the beginning of the conversation, hearing you talk and hearing Dylan talk there about in-betweenness, that is such an important thing really with this biculturality. I mean, we talk now about being citizens of the world, global citizens, but at the end of the day, is that really, really true? Really? Because in my case, I find I am truly bicultural. But I do notice that reflected in this meanwhile, mientras tanto. Mientras tanto is a thing I didn't even know myself that is running through almost everything I'm doing. In the middle of the poem, y mientras tanto, something else is occurring always. I kind of feel a ghost to some of the things because I'm not physically there, yet I still feel it kind of belongs to me directly somehow. So that is a meanwhile kind of situation.
Yeah, I love the idea of a meanwhile situation. Yeah, and I'm wondering, I'm going to draw Dylan in on this as well, because in some of your poems, and I'm going to ask you to maybe share the poem Mami non Ancin with us, because that is also a kind of a suspended temporality, in that you correct. This is a poem from the Nahuatl, right? That's been translated into Spanish that you have then kind of adapted and translated into English. But you juxtapose this figure of non Ancin with Mami, presumably the archetypal Irish Mami. So again, we have this kind of suspended temporality. Can you read it for us first, and then ask us, and then inform us maybe about why you did this?
Sure, I'll read it first. It's
Yes.
called Mami non Ancin. It's very short. Please, Mami, when I die, bury me under the kiln. And when you're baking the bread, you can cry for me there. If a passerby asks, Mrs., why all the tears? Just say the firewood's still damp and the smoke hurts your eyes. And so, so as far as I don't speak Nahuatl, but I'm interested in it. And some of my favorite Mexican poetry was composed in Nahuatl. And so this poem, as far as I know, it's called Non Ancin. It's often mistakenly attributed to Nezahualcóyotl, but the experts say probably wasn't composed by him. And as far as I know, Non Ancin is the diminutive of mother. So it could be like in Mexican Spanish, it might be, you know, madrecita or something like that. So the only Irish equivalent I could find is mammy, right? And so I just found it to be a very beautiful, short little poem. And I didn't do much to it. You know, I changed tortillas to bread and a little bit of the vocabulary, but you know, it's basically a translation. But I mean,
what I love about it is the way you put you insert it into a Dublin voice, you know, not just with Mammy, but Mrs. Why All the Tears, and that voicing of it in a different time and a different century, for me, it really resonates, and I think that's what speaks most, and particularly hearing you say it.
Thanks very much. Well, yeah. I mean, like I teach, despite doing the PhD, I teach in high school, and I'm in the school now. And I just came from a class teaching theory of knowledge, and we were looking at this idea of whether knowledge can be considered to be universal or if it's linked to culture. And it's a fascinating topic. We were talking about mathematics and art, and I thought, oh, this is quite interesting. I'm just thinking of it now because I just came from that class, and so I like this idea that Nonantzin is such a Nahuatl poem. If you sort of try to read it in the original with the crib notes in Spanish, and it's such a Mexican poem, but then it's so universal as well. And that's that old thing about, you know, the universal and the peculiar. I don't know who first came up with that idea, but we've heard it so many times that it's real. You know, the more sort of you get into specific detail, for some reason, the more you realize that people all over the world are dealing with the same issues despite differences, you know?
Yes, but you manage that juxtaposition really in a really interesting way. I'm wondering if you might read another one for us as well, Dylan, before I draw on some of our other guests.
Sure.
And I'm wondering about maybe The Bones of Anonymous Children, if you would be so kind as to read that and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a poem that when I occasionally, before the pandemic, I occasionally get invited to read. So I've been to Nicaragua, Colombia, Miami, Zacatecas and places. And I usually don't read this poem because it requires so much sort of explanation to anyone who's not from Ireland. And it contains, you can't see it on the screen, but it contains a quotation from Father Fintan Monaghan, who I believe was the secretary of the Archdiocese of Tuam. And after many remains of Irish dead children were found under a septic tank, he kind of said, you know, that was the old days, you know, things have moved on. And maybe he was talking about something that happened 50 years ago. And I was walking around Cholula, Puebla, when looking at the pyramid there, while this story was breaking, and these ideas I had to express them. So I'll just read the poem now. It's called Bones of Anonymous Children. At the southwest corner of Tlachihueltepetl, the skeletal remains of 2 sacrificed children were unearthed. There was evidence of cranial irregularities, deformed babies' skulls smashed for ritual. Everyone knew the stainless souls of the very young were the messengers that Tlaloc could never refuse. When the rains fell hard upon Cholulan farms, it was clear that the murder of youngsters was a necessary horror. It made sense. It had purpose. I suppose we can't really judge the past from our point of view, from our lens. All we can do is mark it appropriately and make sure there is a suitable place here where people can come and remember the babies that died. And so it is marked at the foot of arguably the largest pyramid on the planet, church plonked atop, and tourists can know the ancient evils of sacrifice. A child asked a guide why the pyramid with its trees and grass and squirrels looks still like a hillock. He is told, and the adults listen too, how a proper excavation would untangle the muscular roots of millennial trees, upsetting the soils of gods and men, an unholy mess. The spiritual and physical constructs of all those years will come crashing down around us. We'd never clean that up.
I find the last words are very haunting there, Dylan. We'd never clean that up, but also the whole central concept of sacrifice is just really powerful. And I think you bring something very, very new, that the meditation, if you like, about the pyramid and that centuries practice of sacrifice into the consideration of what is, a full horror that's still unveiling before our eyes, of course, in the present day in Ireland. So thank you for sharing that, and I'm sure there will be comments and questions further about that. I'm going to move back to Isabela by means of moving forward and drawing in our other guests in a moment. But first, Isabela, I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, and I'm hoping that you can see this. Because as we've mentioned already, Isabela is a multidisciplinary artist, and she's a musician as well as a visual artist and poet. And this is a project from a number of years ago now, the Shapelín Galeras, the Galeras Oratory. And I'm wondering, Isabela, if you might like to share with the audience gathered, what is your thinking behind this, and what is going on in the image before our eyes here?
Thank you, Nuala, and thank you, Dylan, for your poems. That was a two-part artistic act. The first one was to declare the Galeras Oratory a buffer zone. It was an actual official declaration for the duration of the festival. And the thinking behind that was looking at heritage sites and archaeological sites as witnesses. We're talking about the past, we're talking about memory. I think actually these places have a tendency to commemorate themselves. They're kind of like some type of cemetery. They're the bones of civilizations that constructed certain things. So they bring to memory to me things like, and in particular, I remember being in Asia, walking around the remains of old universities and kind of thinking, will we be thinking, do you remember when people used to make art? There was that space. Do you remember when universities could fulfill something other than, like maybe filling the job market, or all these kind of questions? And a buffer zone, of course, as well, is a space. This comes from another time that's out of time, but is kind of living with us. So even though I know that this is not really true, what I'm going to say, coming from Peru, I always felt that these places were outside of public property, or rather private property, that they actually belong to everyone, right? They belong to everyone. It's a temporary space, buffer, in which we can look in a boundary-less manner at things that have gone, and that things are transient, things change. And the second part of that, of course, is the obsession with stone as well, being Peruvian, just completely important. Was also, there's a lot of twinning of cities here. I live in the west of Ireland, small towns, we are twinned with other places in Europe. So I thought these are places that belong to everyone, why not twin them as well? So I did a twinning of the Nazca lines with a Galeras Oratory. And with that, quite interested in the Irish language myself. I'm extremely interested. I think it's an extraordinarily beautiful language, but also as a reference, of course, to our native languages in Peru, which there are many. And just to remember, of course, that the Spanish language is the colonial language as well. So those were the main ideas around this project.
Yeah. It's such an original and fascinating take on it. And again, just for our audience, this is the Galeras Oratory in Dingle, County Kerry, and a project Isabela was involved in some years ago. And I love the idea about the buffer zone as some kind of safe space, but which is also a space of creativity, right? And imagining across borders, across time, obviously, as you've said, across spaces. Perhaps Isabela, you might read your poem Nazca. And by then I'll be able to link in with John, who has similar interests in these in this extraordinary historical phenomenon. And again, if you'd like to read in Spanish, I will do the rendering in English.
Thank you very much, Nuala. And there is mientras tanto here too.
Yeah.
Nazca. Solo volando hacia las estrellas y mirando hacia abajo, se ven los dibujos en el desierto seco que no se borran, esa misma sequedad que nos pinta una ballena. Mientras tanto, la lluvia sigue mojando el mar de Irlanda.
Nazca. Only flying to the stars and looking down, Can you see the drawings on the dry desert that won't fade, that same dryness that paints us a whale? In the meantime, the rain continues to wet the Irish Sea. And again, I suppose we're seeing that recurrence of that sense of temporality, the meantime, the mientras tanto, the drawing together of different worlds and different times in such an evocative way, Isabela. And I'm going to use the Nazca line by way of connecting with a third of our guests today, which is John Ennis. And many of you here today may be familiar with John, who has been publishing for many decades now, not just poetry, many other genres as well, but probably best known as a poet. He's a former recipient of the Patrick Kavanagh Award. He's been an editor of Poetry Ireland. His selected poems were published in 1997. And since then he has published multiple collections. And there is a real sense of the global in John's work, a sense of connectedness to many other times, to many other contexts. And I love one of the reviews of his books from many years ago now, from the Cork Examiner, Sean Dunn, says, and I love this quotation, and I'll read it to you now: "He leaves many other poets looking watery and confined to limited forms, like people who never stir out of the house." And I think that is a particular resonance today with many of us who haven't stirred out of the house since the start of the pandemic. So it probably takes on a slightly different meaning. But nevertheless, John is a prolific poet and continues to be active since his retirement from Waterford Institute of Technology, where he was head of humanities for many, many years. So welcome, John. And I'm going to bring John into conversation with Giovanni Mangiante, who joins us from Peru. We're delighted to have you here with us, Giovanni. Giovanni is a bilingual poet, and one of the really interesting things about him is this bilingual nature. He tells us that he learned his English, his phenomenally native English, through PlayStation, which is in itself a conversation that we could have for a long time, and writes bilingually, both English and Spanish. His book, Poems Written Under Peruvian Winters, or Poemas Escritos Bajo Inviernos Peruanos, is due to come out. And John has been involved also in the translation, Giovanni, excuse me, has been involved in the translation of John's work. So there is a wonderful relationship of collaboration between both of those. And I'm going to invite them both to intervene now in the questions that we've been considering alongside Isabela and Dylan. And John, I'm going to start with you about the Nazca lines, because you have a number of poems, if you like, that showcase your interest in and the way in which you are inspired by histories of Latin America, and in particular Peru. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks very much. Kind word you said. I'm especially interested in, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. I'm interested in archaeology, especially in forensic archaeology. And for me, it proves the saying of Oscar Wilde, you know, people don't change even over thousands of years. It's only hats and adjectives change. You know, Wilde had so much wisdom, and I love documentaries on TV as well. I tend to move towards the documentary channels quite a lot, and geographic channels as well. And I came across this documentary on the area called Nazca, right, which of course is very, very old. And immediately there were present day resonances, because Nazca was once a very fertile place, in the same way as many parts of the earth were and have been fertile, but now they're drying up because of climate change. So that struck me, and then it was their response to that in their own time. For example, the water levels are way, way down in the earth. So it had to build these tremendous circular wells to go down just to get water to survive. And as you look down on these marvelous lines in Nazca, they're very geometrical and they look like runways. And I honed in on this for the poem. Nazca, they're giant runways from the sky, those who wanted to be remembered, as the world was shriveling to white dust beneath their feet, and only a few mollusks of fresh water times remained, and a voice, it's rumored, offering himself up for the people, a tree from his body in ceramic resurrection. Nazca, a place for tourists from the skies. Times, though, still less barbarous than ours, forgotten in the latest reruns, self-promotions, the sluices busy and the incinerators, the camps, the new slave drives, the prisons escalating by the day and to come, the aeons wilting too, our lovely daughters, our sons.
And I love the way you, again, that you evoke this sense of connectedness, the our daughters, our sons, this sense of, going back to what you've just been saying, the sense about the earth belonging to everyone, and the sense of unchanging, things that don't change, while in the face of many things that do. Would you say that's a current that runs through all of your work, John?
I say it is. I tend to think of the poet as having a Janus head, looking back and looking forward, or looking at the present and making connections. And I find very often archaeology does that. You know, even the excavations of the pyramids at the moment and the thought processes of the people who lived around that time. This is in Egypt. And not only Egypt, but in my own country as well, Ireland. I should say, I moved between Waterford and Westmeath. I'm actually speaking from my also headquarters in Westmeath, it's the old family farm.
Very good.
And there was a discovery made some time ago when excavations were going on for a new highway, new road development in 52. And there they found a burial place going back some 4,000 years. And it was just the homeliness of that, the person being buried. He hadn't suffered from anything. He just lived into his 40s or 50s. He didn't die a violent death. And then he had these ritual containers with him for food into the next life. And then across his wrist, there was a wrist of a young person, probably early teenager, who was across his wrist, okay, as if he were mining this youngster. And not only that, but in the slab across the tomb, they found his milk tooth from a baby. So this is what can be found now to modern excavations. And with just the interrelatedness of all of that, the homeliness of it, you know, over enormous swathes of time. So it's something that I like exploring.
Do you think that parallel between, I'm interested in when you talk about archaeology and the importance of archaeology, you know, that sense of archaeology, that truth of the land that's buried, you know, deep beneath the surface, that there's a parallel between that and poetry, you know, that we often talk about poetry as also the receptacle of some kind of deep truth beyond language, beyond words.
Yeah, there's that. I often think as of poetry as a process of exploration. As you're rooting down, you find a root or part of something that's living, and then you clear away the dross around that, and suddenly you have this living thing, a tree or whatever. So I do approach it from that point of view. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, Dylan, I'm just going to draw you back in again, because I'm struck by the connection between archaeology and obviously Isabella. It's there with Isabella as well, that preoccupation with the land and with the earth. But in your work, Dylan, it is omnipresent as well, that sense of that buried past in Mexico, that part of your landscape. Is there something about poetry that enables you to capture that, do you think? Is it a particularly effective way of trying to engage with it?
Well,
I don't.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask Dylan first, then you can. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in the idea of the palimpsest, you know, the manuscript that creeps through underneath another one. And as I say, you know, Mexico feels very much that way. How you can see the past, and you don't even have, I mean, I am fascinated by archaeology, but you don't even have to dig that far. You know, we have in Mexico City, you know, electrical workers finding fantastic sculptures, and, you know, digging the metro, they're finding all sorts of things, you know, and everyone says underneath the main square, the Zocalo, it's filled with artifacts, but, you know, there's things you can't dig up anymore. So yeah, archaeology has always been a fascination with me. And yeah, as I say, you don't even have to dig that far to find the past. And yeah, it's all about the past and the present existing at the same time. That's a fascination of mine. Yeah.
John, I don't know, did you want to come back in on that?
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, all right, that's good. I'm wondering, John, would you be able to share with us your poem, The Dead Conquistadors, as well? Would you? I think that would be a wonderful thing for the audience to be able to hear.
Okay, if I can find it here. Yeah, actually, my interest in this poem goes back a long time, because I originally saw what was probably an earlier version of it in an Albardo collection of poetry from Peru, way back in the 1970s, and Antonio Cisneros. He was one of the poets I really liked in that. And he had this poem, Los Inquisidores Muertos, and I immediately took to it and I made a translation. And then I don't know where that book has gone to. It maybe with my archives, I'm not sure. But I looked up his poem again, okay, and a later version of what I remember. But I did an approximation or after Antonio Cisneros, because there are things that work in Spanish that don't necessarily work in English, but it does give a sense of what happened at that time.
Yeah.
Across the rivers they appeared, the steely-eyed conquistadors, who curled their beards, never slept as they skint the land. Merchants and crosses and brandy, they began their cities with a temple. During the summer of 1536, the rain fell in buckets. None were riveted with the rusting armour. There grew as well black figs between pews and altars. On the roofs, sparrows shut up the peak of the bells. Afterwards, in Peru, none was master, even shuffling about your house and walking on the dead, sleeping beside the white chairs or swamps, sharing a bed with some cancerous kin. Suffering the droppings of spider and scorpion, few survived even their horses.
It's a very, very vivid depiction, isn't it?
It's vivid and it's blunt and it's to the point in terms of the conquest at that time, and then the effect it had on the conquerors as well. They were in a totally alien environment, and then the environment took its toll on them as well. Yeah,
yeah, and it's wonderfully rendered there, also in very vivid language. And I'm going to pause there for a moment to bring in Giovanni, and welcome Giovanni, and thank you for joining us. And I'm wondering if you might talk to us a little bit, because I know that you and John have worked together, and you have actually been responsible for some of the translation of John's work into Spanish. So maybe you might talk to us a little bit about that relationship first, before I'll ask you a few questions about your own practice. Can you hear me?
Sure. Isabela's going to talk, or?
No, I'm asking you, Giovanni, if you could.
Oh, me. I heard Isabela.
Sorry, that was directed at you. That's okay. the joys of virtual conversations. So I'm asking you if you might just help us understand how you came in touch with John and started this relationship of translation for a Spanish-speaking audience.
All right. So I met John through Facebook. I was having lunch when I got his message, and I saw it's a quite in-depth examination of some of my poetry, and I was very curious about joining in discussion about this, even though I would say my knowledge is quite limited when it comes to literature and analysis of poetry and prose and everything related to literature. Comparing the expertise of John to mine, it's a world of difference. But I was intrigued. I wanted to give it a shot and build this relationship, build this friendship, And so I took my time to read his analysis of my work, and I responded, and we switched to emails, got to know each other a little more, because Facebook had this very narrow columns, when you type messages, and it's quite uncomfortable. Emails are much better to communicate. And well, it sounds kind of cliche to say this, but I guess it's one thing led to another. I never imagined, and I'm pretty sure John didn't imagine we would get this far either, to translate me translating his work, and you know, working together on my first book of poetry, and being here in this conference, you know. So when he presented with Mariela Eligi, I think it's how you pronounce her last name. When they both presented me with the idea of translating work from John, I was delighted. I had never translated a poet's work in a formal situation, you know, for a seminar or a journal. So when I got the opportunity, I was delighted. I received 4 poems that Mariela chose. And it was really a test for me as well, you know, sit down there and try to, as we spoke with John, not have like a translation of the poem, but a version, right? A version of the poem. So we don't have this thing about language lost in translation. You know, it's very typical to talk about that, but it's true. It's very true. And to avoid that, sometimes you gotta morph the poem into a different language. Sometimes you use the tools of a different language to give it life, right? And it's also really great when both the translator and the poet both are poets, right? So there's a better understanding when it comes to language and imagery and all of that, and that brings me to have my notes here about the poems we worked on, then and how I use. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm going to ask you to maybe read 1 or 2 of those together. John maybe reading the original and then you reading the Spanish. But I wanted to pick up a couple of things that you were saying, Giovanni, because about, you know, that cliche about the loss that is involved in translation. But of course, there's also tremendous gain too, isn't it? The way in which translation enables us to see other poetic worlds through other languages, and that's also part of the creative process, right? And the other thing I would pick up on that with your work is, of course, you're already moving between the worlds of English and Spanish, aren't you, in your own work? So I'm wondering, did that make it easier for you? You know, the fact that you are also writing work creatively in both languages, or was it very different to take on John's voice and John's poetic language?
Actually, it was thanks to John that I decided to take part in my language a lot more, because I've been strictly an English poet, right? I've been writing in English for like 3 years, and been like scared of trying Spanish. And John was like, hey, you should try dual language. You should try, incorporating your own language and try translations and get to know people from there. So I saw this as an opportunity, everything, right? I was like, okay to everything. I'll do it. Right. And now I've been published in 2 magazines from Latin America. One is called Casa Bukowski. It's from Chile. And I'm currently doing a project with them of sort of like a voiceover kind of thing. I'm reading Bukowski poems because I have a professional microphone and everything, and they're broadcasted on their radio. They have Radio Bukowski, and I've also worked with the Cametza Peru, which it's also a magazine from here that they published 3 poems of mine in Spanish, right? And that led to me being invited to the poetry festival, a very big thing. It's this 26th, to read some of my poetry. I was invited there. So as I said, one thing led to another. I was not expecting any of this, right? It was John being kind of like the professor pushing the student, right? Break your boundaries, try a little more. And I got to where I am right now in terms of Spanish and English. So yeah, it was difficult at the beginning, of course.
Well, it sounds like it's been a very enabling experience. And I'm wondering, before I get onto the translations, I'm wondering, Giovanni, if you might read your poem about Lima. And I guess part of my rationale for asking you this is that, there are many of us here who really wished that we actually were in Lima for this conference. And unfortunately, given the pandemic, we're tuning in from many different points in the world. So I'm hoping that your poem, which will evoke Lima for us, for those of us that cannot be there, and we'll get a sense a little bit of your poetic voice and your work as it currently stands. So would you read that for us?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
All right. I'll read the Spanish, you read the English, right?
Can you read both? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
no problem.
Yeah.
No problem. All right. Humble Lima of Scab Gray, plowing through years of anniversaries inside a winter foggy Lima that gnaws at your fingernails until it makes its way to your lungs and knives at your alveoli. A father and a mother go out a ganarse las lentejas for their ñaños. My humble humid Lima, my sometimes outlaw Lima. There's so much smog in your atmosphere, smoking a cigarette is overkill. Your dirty gray buildings don't welcome the rain, but need it. Your brick exposed unfinished houses may sort of sight up some, but believe this, somnolent Lima, inside there's a home. The world may continue to fall apart, but the heart of a Peruvian family will stay the same. Lo mero mismito, a pucho at the bus stop at 2 a.m, and keep eyes on your back. My humble humid Lima, we won't let the gray overcome you. Right, I'll read the Spanish now. Humilde Lima de gris costra, arremetiendo contra años de aniversarios dentro de una invernal nublada Lima que roe tus uñas hasta que llega a tus pulmones y apuñala tus alvéolos. Un padre y una madre van a ganarse las lentejas para sus ñaños. Mi humilde, húmeda Lima, mi a veces foragida Lima, hay tanto smog en tu atmósfera, que fumarse un cigarro es exagerar por joder. Tus edificios grises y sucios no dan la bienvenida a la lluvia, pero la necesitan. Tus casas sin terminar, con ladrillos expuestos, hacen daño a la vista de algunos, pero créeme esto, Lima somnolienta, adentro hay un hogar. El mundo continuará cayéndose a pedazos, pero el corazón de la familia peruana se mantendrá intacto. Lo mero mismito, fumarse un pucho en el paradero a las 2 de la mañana y con los ojos hasta por la espalda. Mi humilde, húmeda Lima, no dejaremos que el gris te venza. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. And while there's a lot of grayness in the poem, I think it still presents it to us as a very vivid experience of the city in a way that we can only imagine, of course, those of us that are so far away from it. And I'm wondering if we might be able to draw John back in here, and if you might share some of the experience of the translation. So the work that John, of the poems that you wrote and that Giovanni later translated, and we might have some comments afterwards then about that process, what was lost, what was gained, what was learned, what was enabled, and what was envisioned by that. So John, would you like to start? I'm thinking of the Becker forgives.
Ah, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about this?
I can, yes. Very briefly, I've been in touch for many years with Professor Iligi from Universidad de La Pampa in Argentina. My work was featured on the syllabus there for a good number of years. And then she was developing a new course as well. It was a diploma taken through Spanish in Irish studies, which of course was unique. But it was meant for people of Irish extraction primarily who were living in South America, and they would take it and qualify. So it was novel, and she was looking for new poems for this. And I suggested then that Giovanni and I might work on some, and the Becker poem comes from that. It has both the additional connection of the mainland with Spain. So there was that dimension to it. The poem itself, Becker Forgives, it's from an era collection of mine down in the deeper Helicon. It came out with the Little Spritz in 1994, and it was a book of experimental sonnets, reaching out to writers, mostly poets with whom I felt a deep communion. And it stems from the time when I was head of humanities in Waterford, Institute of Technology, and we were redesigning our art course, okay? Sorry, I missed the connection there. we're redesigning our art course and making the characters in a painting move again. Okay, so in this poem here, the protagonist moves. The protagonists in this poem are Becker's lover, who rejected him, and then her partner. He was born in Sweden in 1836, he died in 1870, he died of TB at the age of 34. And then his poem, Valverán las oscuras golondrinas, comes from his rimas and these are personal heartbreak following a love twist. Okay, so it has an ornate rhyming scheme of 6 times 4 lines each. First line, 11 syllables, third of some 13, and it's rain in by the 4th. So it's really a very technically accomplished poem. So it's really challenging doing that, but it remains one of the most popular poems in the Spanish canon. There's an that I still love, and it's Ricardo for each Spanish poetry, and it ends this this marvelous LP, and so that's the background to it. Then there, okay.
Okay.
And
can you read?
I'll read the poem then. Okay. Becker begins. Okay. The dark swallow in you now will soon return, sleek and graceful swallow of my dream. I'll watch you build your nest with clay, learn of tenderness again, your wing close to his, as you both climb blue skies for hapless insects, stop a second in the air. You savor his flight and yours, until twilight or rain forces you both down within the honeysuckles. Too fragrant, too fair, it is my grief to hear your wing tap no more on my window pane. While I write, the massive dews fall soft and slow. Let these notes of mutual forgiveness be ours. They thud in my vitals, each as a hammer blow, where I lose count. Through your sleeping hours, my body grieves. On you both may love flow unguent, whom the twittering summer days have joined.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, Giovanni, would you be able to share the Spanish version of that? If you could read, that would be wonderful.
Yes. I was loading the file here. Okay. Becker, perdona. La oscura golondrina que te habita está por retornar. La agraciada y pulcra golondrina de mi sueño. Te veré construir tu nido de arcilla, abrazar lo tierno otra vez, tu ala cerca a la suya, mientras escalan azules cielos en busca de insectos sin fortuna, detenerse en el aire. Saborea su vuelo y el tuyo, hasta que el crepúsculo o la lluvia los fuerce de vuelta a la madre selva. Fragante y blanca, es mi aflicción de no volver a escuchar tu ala golpear mi ventana. Mientras escribo, los rocíos caen suaves y lentos. Sean nuestras estas gotas de mutuo perdón. Ellas chocan contra mis órganos, cada uno como golpe de martillo. Pero pierdo la cuenta. En tus horas de sueño mi cuerpo adolece. Que en ustedes el amor fluya, bálsamo, quienes a nerviosos días de verano se han unido.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. You really bring that alive in Spanish as well. It's wonderful to hear it. And I'm going to pause the discussion for one moment just to invite members of the audience to raise their hands for questions. If they have some, you can pop a message in the chat, either a comment or a reflection. It would be lovely to transmit some of those reflections back to the panelists. We're all aware of how difficult it can be in these Zoom conversations to actually have a sense of who your audience is and whether people are listening. So anything at all that can be transmitted back to our panelists, I know would be appreciated by them, and I can ask any questions on your behalf. You are, of course, able to ask your own questions. You can just use the raise hand function, I think, and hopefully can turn on your microphone and pose a question to that. And I'm going to come back again on the question of the translation process. And I'm wondering, Isabela, I might draw you back in here. I was struck when I was listening to Giovanni reading his poem about Lima, about the way in which often as when you're placed in this position of being a so-called immigrant poet or a voice for somewhere else, do you find that you're constantly in a mode where you're culturally translating all the time for Irish audiences about Peru, about history, about Latin America. How does that work out in your life?
Well, I really want to thank Giovanni for that poem. I absolutely love it. And I want to thank John for encouraging Giovanni to write in Spanish. Because for me, the Spanish went right to the heart. That's the thing about meaning. Same with John's absolutely gorgeous poem. The way Giovanni translated that into Spanish is like black and white and technicolor. Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that happens with emotion connected to your native or the language that is in your heart before we can speak. But in terms of translation as a general thing, and what you're saying there, Nuala, I've begun to think of translation as wearing a mask, like in COVID. Like a good side and a bad side. Because one thing I noticed walking around the supermarket before COVID, sometimes little children, they would be making songs. They would be bored with their parents. They would be making up songs about the milk or the bread, and they'd be singing it out loud, completely unconscious. And now I notice adults are doing this. I noticed this week when I was doing my weekly shop, an adult behind the mask singing, because they think it cannot be noticed because there's a mask on. So I think there is a good side and a bad side, and I would equate translation to mask wearing. But I also would say finally that I think translation of poetry is completely specific. Mm. It's something separate and it's its own thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's another language, another world.
Yeah, and I like the analogy you draw with the mask. I mean, there's also much written, isn't there, about the invisibility of the translator, the way in which that kind of part of a process whereby something gets translated is just erased as if it was somehow seamless and easy, which of course, as anyone who's been involved in it will know that is not the case. Dylan, on that question about being kind of a cultural translator on a kind of a habitual basis, do you find, is that part of your role?
Well, look, I get asked questions in Mexico from like, how did I vote in Scottish independence? Am I going to vote for Trump? What was my opinion on Brexit? So, I get all sorts of questions, So not only do I speak for Ireland, I speak for lots of places that people think I'm from, Yeah. I got into a taxi in Oaxaca and the taxi driver said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Dublin, Ireland." And he said, "Oh my God, I used to work in Maryland on a farm." And I thought, well, I don't really know what to say to that, right? So people are often asking me about Ireland, but also Scotland and England and the USA, and then places I have never been, like Australia, So whether you like it or not, you get in this role, And so I never thought of myself as extraordinarily patriotic, but I do find myself now sort of correcting people and telling people, well, actually in Ireland, this happens. And, and I tell them about the St. Patrick's Battalion, and other Irish people have been in Mexico, and Juan O'Gorman, who made the library in UNAM. So I find myself like telling people about the links between Ireland and Mexico, because many people here don't know about them. Yeah, and when it comes to translation, I'm sort of I've translated a couple of things, like in Blood Oranges and in my new manuscript, but I chose things that I wanted to say, and then you find that someone else has just said it and they said it brilliantly. And then, so I just want other people to read it, So like whether it's by Tlaltecatzin, Nezahualcóyotl, or whoever, the old poets, I just want someone to be able to read it. But then I think, well, if I'm going to translate it, I might as well make it a little bit different, right? So make it more accessible, like Non Unseen, and sort of put my own spin on it. So I do sort of transplant it, and I think I mentioned before, like people ask me what my influences are, and I take them from wherever I can get them, and I'm very interested in contemporary art, visual art, some conceptual art is awful, and then some is fascinating, and sort of this idea of taking something from one place and then putting it somewhere else, and it changes it, I was reading a poem recently by Ada Limon, and the first line is the same as the last line, except they're not, because of what has happened in the poem, Yeah. So just transplanting, moving words from one place to another can be very fruitful, very interesting, and draw attention to all sorts of things.
Yeah, that the actual movement itself generates this, which is a really interesting thing to think about. And I think the way you describe it there, and I think it's come through too in Isabela's words, but also Giovanni's reflections about something becoming new, something becoming transformed, this process of alchemy that happens when you move it from one language to another, but also all of the other mutations that take place at the same time. But I'm also interested, Dylan, in the way you kind of hark back to kind of older ideas around the poet as educator and with a broader kind of public role. You know, you think of the historic responsibilities of the bard, for example, in the Irish tradition, and similar cross-cultural references in other cultures where poets occupied this important space, not just as the writer of poetic language, but also as a transmitter of knowledges in different contexts, and with a very important kind of public role as educator. I'm sure that's not how you feel it when you're fielding questions from taxi drivers about Maryland, but it does speak to that broader remit, I guess, of the writer.
Well, my day job is as an educator, so maybe it becomes a 24-hour job at some point. But no, I mean, when I'm talking about poetry, I don't like to see myself as educator, you know. But I mean, you know, there was a time when Pablo Neruda could talk to a stadium full of people, you know, and it does seem that like the role of the poet, who knows what's happening, you know? Are people still reading poetry? Heaney likes to talk about, you know, when there's a funeral, when there's a graduation, when poetry, when we need it, and we do need it, it needs to be there. So you might not feel you need it every day, but when there's a graduation, a wedding, or some tragedy, people grope for it. They love it. They need it. They want it. The pandemic, we saw all sorts of people reaching for poetry. So we got to remember that, you know, we need it. We just might not know when or where we need it, you know? You asked the question earlier on, I didn't really answer it. You were asking, like, is poetry best suited? I forgot to answer it, as always happens in these things. Is poetry sort of uniquely suited for dealing with these questions of the past and the present? And well, the answer, I suppose, I don't know. You know, I'm thinking of other artworks that deal with this, like cinema is great for this, with montage and flashbacks and all of this. But in visual arts, I don't know, you have to be very careful to not make it seem too didactic. I think of like Diego Rivera's murals, they're fantastic, but extremely didactic, you know, where he shows the top layer of civilization and he shows, you know, what's going on underneath, you know. But for me, words are my medium, and for me, they're wieldy and they're malleable, and they can sort of evoke a dream. The way that dreams work and the way that thoughts work, where there's a lot of things happening at the same time. So for me, it's easiest to use poetry because I can't paint, for example, you know. So I mean, talking about this, I can read very shortly. I have a very short poem that I shared with you. That it's called "And What Is My Heart," and I read it in Nicaragua, and I was worried because I you know, I get introduced as the Irish poet, and I go to an international festival and there's poets from all around the world. And I kind of feel bad because I'm getting up there with my first book that's mostly about Mexico, because of where I live and where I wrote it. And people are expecting me to sort of talk about Ireland, you know. And so I thought this poem would work. And I call it "And What Is My Heart," but it's actually sort of a sort of translation of an anonymous ancient Irish poem that was in English would be called "The Mother's Lament at the Slaughter of the Innocents," so inspired by the biblical story. And when I wrote it, it got published in an ebook called "Poets for Ayotzinapa." So I think it's this idea of how sort of poetry can speak to us across many, many years. And we don't even know who composed this. And it's much longer in the original Irish version, but so I'll just read it very, very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
And when I read it in Nicaragua, I dedicated it to mothers in Mexico and Nicaragua and Colombia and many other places, and Ireland, of course. So it goes like this. "And what is my heart? And a woman said, my breasts are milkless, my eyes are damp, my skeleton is frail, it rattles. And what I want is this. I want you to kill me now instead." And another woman said, "What am I without my child? And what is my heart? From this day until the last, a cold clot of blood."
Thank you, Dylan. That Very, very powerful words there, and they resonate, I think, for all of us in different ways. And I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of this session, and there is another session commencing shortly, another keynote. So I'm going to ask again the audience if there's anybody who would like to say something or ask a question. I think we have them all spellbound by the beauty of the language that you have shared with them. I'm hoping very much that they have enjoyed the session as much as I have, and I have learned so much from seeing the connections between all of you, and most importantly from listening and viewing, in the case of Isabela, samples from your work, and to get an insight into the way in which your creative practice evolves, continues to evolve. Giovanni, we look forward to seeing your collection when it is published, and it is really heartwarming to hear of the way in which John has encouraged you, and with John it is inspiring to see that you are still actively engaged and producing all this wonderful work, and that your work gains new audiences like those of Mariella's students in Argentina. And with Isabela, we're just, I'm just thrilled to have been able to welcome you here today and to have you speak with such eloquence and with such profoundness about your practice and where you are and how your work has evolved. And Dylan, as ever, it's always entertaining and enlightening and wonderful to have a conversation with you and for you to share your work. And I'm very glad that we ended with those beautiful words of yours. So I'm going to close the session now. There are lots of very appreciative comments in the chat. What a masterclass in poetry, art and translation. I learned so much. Congratulations to all. Gracias a todos. Una maravilla. Poemas muy profundos. Other really wonderful words of welcome for the poem, Giovanni, Una belleza Lima, apela a todos los sentidos. And a lovely comment here from Brendan Tobin, Isabela, saying, beautiful Isabela, as an Irishman with Peruvian nationality, the stones are ever present. So maybe with that sense of the stones all around us, even though we can't be in Peru, I'm going to say a huge thank you to our guests, to John, Giovanni, Isabela, and Dylan. And I'll close the session and with a reminder to everybody that the next session is a keynote lecture by Professor Linda Connolly, and that starts in 15 minutes time at 4 p.m. Irish time. Thank you so much to everybody. Bye-bye.